Hello everyone, welcome to lecture 2 for the GMIM Business Project. Today we're really going to focus on the project itself and the contents of the project and walk through what the expectations are and hopefully provide you with some guidance in terms of what you're meant to achieve at the end of the project. Then I will outline the next steps and talk about the Zoom session and what will be happening at tomorrow's Zoom session. So let's begin with the end in mind. As a reminder, we expect your presentation to be a quasi-academic presentation, and you will be expected to present for 30 minutes where every member of the team will present. And you are expected to include an introduction, a literature review, a methodology, a section on analysis and results, and finally, discussion and recommendations. And it's really important to remember that all projects must have a research element. So let's talk about the introduction. What's the expectation of the introduction? Well, the introduction generally have several components. The first is, of course, establishing the context of the project, developing a clear problem statement, or some students include a research question, making it very clear the goals and objectives of the project. I like to tell students to distinguish between primary and secondary goals. In terms of the primary goals, it's the core of the project, what you're trying to achieve, but you may have other goals that are not um, critical to the project, but they were important to the client that you'd also want to include in terms of the objectives, but you can distinguish between primary and secondary objectives so that as we look through the presentation and we look through your recommendations, most of it should focus on your primary objectives. And then if you have other secondary objectives, we can look at it that way. I'd like to contrast this by having several primary objectives. And sometimes that puts the group into a bit of trouble because when you have a vast list of primary objectives, we would be assessing the methodology, the literature, and the recommendations against all those primary objectives. We expect, of course, in the introduction, what you plan to deliver in the end or what's the expected output of the project. And I always tell students also be clear about what is out of scope. And this is not for every type of project. But if you have a project where, for example, you're doing an innovation project and you're using a particular methodology and you've chosen that another obvious methodology will not be included or another obvious bit of literature would not be included in the project, it's good to upfront establish that this is out of scope and why it's out of scope. So for example, you can say this project will focus on open innovation techniques. Um, However, closed innovation techniques is out of scope because it generally doesn't generate the level of innovation and radical new ideas that were expected by the client. So in scope and out of scope is really used when you're really trying to narrow the focus of the project. And here you're trying to justify why you've chosen a particular path in the project and you make that clear from up front. And in that way, your assessors or markers never really ask, why don't you look at this literature? Why don't you think of this angle to the project? Because you've justified it up front, why you've chosen a particular route to pursue. Of course, there are other things you do in the introduction, like introduce the teams. You can do some signposting, and signposting is just an expression used to say that you explain what comes next. So in this presentation, we're going to cover the literature review and then this and X, Y, Z, right? So you can do some signposting. And some students like to do a sort of brief outline of the results as a teaser, and that's perfectly fine also. So those are the components generally of an introduction and what's expected. There are some common pitfalls in terms of developing an introduction. First is a lack of seamless link between the scope, the literature review, the methodology, the analysis, the recommendations, which addresses again your scope. So a project needs to be consistent right through. When you've established the introduction and the scope of the project, that should, I should, we should be able to see a clear link between the scope and the literature that you've chosen to assess. And then the literature should really link to the methodology you use to actually answer the brief. And then the analysis or the analytical methods should link to the methodology because, of course, if you do qualitative methodology, I would expect to see certain types of analytical tools, for example, thematic analysis. And of course, if you use a quantitative methodology, I would expect to see a different set of analytical tools. And then that should link back to the recommendations, right? Because the analysis is a summary of what you found, which then drives your recommendations, which then should link back to the scope or the introduction. So a really great project has a seamless link between every element of the project that drives back to the introduction that you've established. So the first common pitfall is when you've actually completed the project and you've completed the recommendations do not match the scope outlined in the introduction. The second common pitfall is what I call a vanity introduction. And a vanity introduction is one where the introduction is overly complicated and unnecessarily so. It's really important in the introduction to develop an introduction that is simple without being simplistic. You're not trying to water down what you're trying to achieve, but you also want it to be understood easily. The third thing that or common pitfall with introductions is the idea that you have too many assumptions left unexplained. You have to remember that the faculty coach who will be assigned to you is not your only marker. They are your first marker, but the second marker has no context of this project, doesn't know anything about the history, doesn't know anything possibly about the client. So don't make the second marker work to understand the projects. I've seen many projects that look exceptional, but it's clear that they are presenting to the faculty coach who totally gets all the different models and concepts, etc., and the description of the introduction. In fact, some of them almost jump over the introduction and get into the details of the project very quickly. But as a second marker, you still have to set the context very clearly so that your second marker can come in and really understand and assess what you've done. So these are three common pitfalls for you to look out for when you actually develop an introduction. The last pitfall is when the introduction is not altered in line with late changes in the project. And this is really, really, really important as far as I'm concerned, because there are many times when you start a project and you have a particular introduction, but through the life of the project changes, but the team forgets to come and seamlessly link the introduction to the new scope of the project. So you almost have to make sure that at the end of your presentation, you go straight back to the introduction and you make sure that the introduction you have is aligned to the new process and recommendations and the direction of the project. So these are some common pitfalls to help you navigate better through developing an effective introduction. I'm happy to take questions tomorrow and I'm happy to give further examples. But the truth is, we are going to actually be putting up sample projects for you to look through to bring these concepts to life. And because we respect people's intellectual property, I don't want to include their project work in this presentation. Instead, I will put them up as samples So as you review this presentation, you should then go and look at the sample presentations, which will be up maybe later in the week, I would say Wednesday or Thursday. And because we need students' permission from previous years to put up their sample presentations for you to view. Okay, so late in the week after you've reviewed this, you should actually then go and look at what really effective projects outlined, and you will see that a lot of the things that I'm discussing here in terms of an effective introduction, you should see that in some of the really good projects that we're going to put up on Moodle for you to review. We will now get started going through the main body of the report. But for each of these sections, I want you to stop and ask yourself why. Why do we need to do a literature review, a methodology, an analysis section, a recommendation section? Because in understanding why, I think it helps to frame and develop a better output in the team. So stop the tape now and reflect and jot down why you think a literature review is necessary in a project of this kind. Okay, I hope you've taken time to reflect on why a literary review is necessary. Here's my simple perspective. The first picture on the left is what your brain is like at the beginning of a project. In fact, everyone's brain, including mine, is like that. You have some knowledge about the issues around, for example, if you have a human resource recruitment issue as the scope of your project or an innovation issue, you do have some knowledge. You have a sort of loose concepts in your brain as to how you should be addressing this project. So this is your brain off of a literature review on the left. And this is your brain on literature review. The idea of a literature review is that it's supposed to order and enlarge your thinking. It allows you to learn from others. And you actually get valuable tips and insights, not just for the literature, but for the methodology, right? It also increases your familiarity and with terminologies and provides a range of the most relevant perspectives. It outlines the most important theoretical frameworks that can help you think through the problems associated with your project in a more meaningful, structured way. It even sets expectations for data collection because through the literature review, you can actually look at the methodologies used in some of the more academic papers. And you can see the type of data they collect to solve issues in that field, right? But very importantly, you're not doing a literature review of a complete body or set of literature associated with your topic. Again, for example, let's say you have an HR recruitment issue. You're really looking at literature that helps you to solve the issue of HR recruitment within the context of that firm, right? So it's really important that your critical review of literature and models are very much in line with the scope and not in line with the topic in total. I think I'm going to say that another way. I have seen projects where students do a very complete literature review. So they review a broad range of literature rather than deep diving into the aspect of, for example, HR recruitment that relates to their specific client context and problem. Because this is not a dissertation, what's really important is to highlight the aspects of the literature that really sheds light, that really orders your thinking, that really enlarges your thinking on the specific scope of the project as opposed to shedding light on the literature that's not relevant. It's not about here, it's not about just including literature for including literature's sake. Here, it's about choosing targeted, very specific literature that shines light on the problem. So, the way I like to understand why a literature review is to understand that before you do a literature review, your brain is not processing all the aspects of the project in total. And then you have a literature review, and it's supposed to help you order your thinking, draw out the most important concepts from others, and really, in a sense, learn from others, right? I love this saying by Newton in 1675. If I have seen further, it's by standing on the shoulders of giants. In a sense, your literature review is standing on the shoulders of giant academics who've already reviewed the topics before you and have set certain concepts and theories and perspectives that can help you really shed light on the problem at hand or the client's specific context and challenges. So that's the why of a literature review. And now that we understand the why, the next step is to talk about what's expected within a literature review. And I like this three-step process called choose, do, conclude, right? The first step of your literature review is based on your problem statement or research question if you have one and client context. Choose the most relevant theories or papers to peruse, right? And once you do that, you want to narrow it to the most relevant articles. As I said before, what you want is a subset of theory that's most relevant as opposed to an exposition of all the literature in the field. Your project is meant to be very focused on the client's needs. So your literature should also be very focused on the client's needs. And you can even explain why these are the most relevant pieces of literature. And again, why you've chosen to exclude certain other types of literature. For example, maybe you just want to include literature on large multinational incumbent firms because you're actually consulting to a large multinational incumbent firm. So you may exclude a certain range of literature because it's related to small firms. You may exclude a range of literature for multiple other reasons, okay? So be very clear when you're doing the literature review what you're including and what you're excluding and why you're excluding certain ranges of literature. Once you've actually chosen the subset or the body of literature that you're going to peruse and generate insights that can help in your consulting project, your next step is to do a systematic analysis of that subset. So you're not doing a systematic analysis of the whole literature. I know I'm going on and on about it, but I'm going on about it because I've seen many teams fall prey to doing a systematic analysis of the whole literature but not deep diving into the most relevant literature. So in the do step, you're doing a systematic analysis of the subset that you consider to be the most relevant literature that sheds light on your projects. And then the final step is the conclude step. And this is another thing that students often um, or teams often fail to do. After you've assessed the literature, you should have some sort of conclusion as to what this means for the client or for the client's challenge, context, and problems, right? So it's really, really, really important to kind of say, okay, I've now perused all this literature and all these papers. And these are the insights I've gotten in summary, and this is how it affects the problem that I've scoped. And this is the insight it provides in the problems that I've scoped. Okay? Of course, this step, choose, do, conclude steps are not as linear as this, right? It is not expected that you would start to choose and you would, at the beginning, choose all the best literature. It's often a very iterative process. For example, you might choose a few papers, you might do a systematic analysis, then you realize that something is excluded, then you go back to choose, then you do, then you try to conclude, but as you learn more information about the client and the client problem, you may find out that, oh, there's some angle of literature that would actually help shed light on this new insight I got for the client. So then I have to go and choose more literature, do, and then conclude. So please note that the choose, do, conclude sort of loop is not linear. It's quite iterative, and you may have to go through 2 or 3 rounds of this. Sometimes even the literature you thought that was most relevant at the beginning is not as relevant as you move through the project, and you have to actually come back to choose, do, and conclude. But so the key here, though, is what you end up with in the end, in terms of your presentation, has to be the most relevant literature for the client. You are not expected to do a comprehensive review of all related available sources of literature, which you would probably do in a more traditional dissertation. The essential task is to critically review the state of literature that can advance your thinking on your problem statement. And as your problem statement evolves, you may have to loop this and do this over and over and over again until you get to the most relevant literature that sheds light on the client challenge. Okay? Now that we've finished or concluded the section on the literature review, let's do the same for the methodology. If you can stop the tape now and reflect just for a few seconds, why or what's the purpose of the methodology section? What are you trying to achieve? Why exactly do we need a methodology in this type of quasi-academic project? To illustrate why we need methodology, consider this example that I have. A leading university in the UK found that drinking 1 to 3 glasses a week of champagne would help to reduce dementia. I'm sure this is a very exciting result for me, for you, for all of us. But what if I told you that this is based on a group of adult male Wistar rats? So the research was done on a group of adult male rats, right? Would that still be such an exciting conclusion? Would you believe that those results were valid for human subjects? Well, this is just to illustrate the point of methodology. Methodology is about increasing the trust fund between you and your assessors, your reviewers, your client. Why? Because a strong, coherent, well-justified methodology makes us believe your results, makes us believe that your recommendations are valid and valuable and relevant to the client's circumstances. Without a good methodology, you will be developing conclusions without the right trust fund. So therefore, if I don't believe your methodology, I won't believe your conclusions. In the very same way, because I don't particularly think that adult male rats are the best people to test to find out the impact of champagne on dementia, how can I therefore believe the conclusion of that article that we should all be drinking 1 to 3 glasses of champagne per day, you know? So really, before you even define your methodology, you have to understand the motivation behind outlining your methodology, which is the bridge between your literature review, which says the most important concepts or the most important perspectives we are going to use to address the challenge at hand is outlined in the literature review. And then the methodology says this is a very trusted way of assessing the issues at hand. Now that we've developed some understanding of the reasons why you would need a sort of robust methodology in a quasi-academic report like this, let's discuss rather briefly what should be involved in that methodology section. Now, I'm very aware that you all have completed a methodology course, so some of this may be repetitive to some of you, but I just like to establish a standard across all projects as to what's expected. Of course, we would expect some sort of introduction to your overall methodological approach, whether or not you're going to use an inductive approach or a deductive logic. And of course, inductive approaches are better when you are focused on areas that lack prior theoretical insight, or areas that where extant theory neglects to explain whatever phenomenon you're interested in. And of course, deductive logic starts with a broad theory, articulates a hypothesis to test this theory, and collects data to test these hypotheses. And of course, you can use a mixed methods also approach. So you would of course introduce your motivation for using an inductive or deductive approach, and then you would quickly describe the specific methods of data collection and empirical observations that you're going to use, explaining why you've chosen that method as opposed to other methods. Included in that would be your sampling approach. Naturally, with qualitative research, the sampling approach tends to be more purposive, and with quantitative research, it should be more random. You should explain whatever primary and secondary sources of data you have. Very importantly, because this came up last year, it is expected that you would collect some primary original observations as part of your project. You cannot just rely on established data that exists, whether that includes an interview, whether that includes focus groups, whether that includes participant observations. Although I would caution against participant observations largely because of COVID, unless that could be done online. I think the rule of thumb due to COVID is that as much as possible, with respect to primary data, try to collect it in a remote fashion. If you have to be sort of in the same location with someone, exceptionally, please speak to your faculty coach and clear this with them. And if you have to do that, of course, you would do it in a socially distanced, responsible way. In addition to just your methods of data collection, sampling, your approaches, who you interviewed, why you interviewed, what archival data you used, what existing data you used, you must also explain how did you ensure quality in the collection and execution of your in the collection of your data, sorry, and in terms of the execution of your whole research process here. And of course, there are different methods of triangulation. Just as a reminder, triangulation refers to approaching a phenomenon from two or more methods or perspectives, and that tends to ensure a higher level of quality or robustness. There are different types of triangulation. There's theoretical triangulation by combining different theoretical perspectives. You have between methods triangulation by using, for example, a combination of interviews, archival data, participant observation. You have triangulation among respondents by gathering data from participants at multiple hierarchies or multiple levels or multiple different backgrounds. And in that way, you can enhance the quality of your research and outcome. Okay. Of like importance to quality control is the ethical considerations. We will be uploading the ethical rules, LSE's ethical rules, onto the Moodle page for you to review. But please liaise with your faculty coach because there are certain boundaries that I would suggest that you don't cross. For example, one of them is the fact that you would need approval, particularly if you plan to interview people under 18 years old. And this approval tends to take rather long. So it's best that you stay away from certain um, informants or interviewees in your project. And this impacted projects last year who were looking at like Gen Z because they couldn't interview anybody under 18 years old. So with respect to the ethics, I would suggest that you review the policy on Moodle, which will be available sometime next week. And as soon as you get your faculty coach, if you think for some reason that you have concerns around ethics, please highlight it to them very early. In addition to ethics, you also have to, it is expected that in the methodology section that you would talk about your approach to analysis, whether of course you're doing statistical analysis, which is about statistical predictions about the relationship between two or more variables, or for example, if you're doing qualitative, we would expect something like thematic analysis, which helps you define the patterns in the qualitative data that you collected. Finally, and very importantly, please remember to address potential limitations. And here, it is really good that if you guys could just anticipate and preempt the methodological concerns of your clients, your reviewers, the faculty who are going to be looking at the report. And what do I mean by this? What I mean by this is that when you develop the methodology, you should consider what are the limitations of your methodology. Is it that you only interviewed 3 people? Is it that your results aren't generalizable? Is it that you didn't have access to a particular type of respondent who was important or integral? And then if you didn't have access, what did you do in order to replace the knowledge or the observations that you were going to ascertain from that respondent in order to ensure that the report maintains the same level of quality? So it's really important for you to consider at the end what potential limitations exist with the methodology approach that you have designed. One last thing I wanted to talk about on this particular slide is the idea of transparency and procedural clarity. And that's really important for when you're working and you're collecting primary data and you're working with informants or interviewees. It's very important that you follow a very clear and robust approach to transparency and procedural clarity, if necessary, confidentiality statements, and again, those will be made available as and when required. So when you look at that list, if it makes you feel very much like this, I'm going to give you 2 bits of advice that might be helpful, but I'm sure your faculty coach can give you additional guidance. First thing I would suggest as a team is to try to visualize the whole research process from end to end. I think in the last video I said depending on the complexity of your research, you may have an exploratory research phase before you actually start your formal research. So in the exploratory research phase, for example, this included some desktop research and some exploratory interviews with the CEO and the senior team. And in doing so, it helps to refine a more complex project and narrow the scope so that it's doable. After that, then the formal research ensues. And here, as a suggestion, this is not for your project, but this is just an example of how you can visualize the whole process. As you can see, the formal research section includes semi-structured interviews, and then it follows by the approach to analyzing the interviews using thematic analysis. And then that leads you to define your recommendations. And then you can also outline what you're going to do to maintain the quality or the quality control process. Here, there was an expert review in the end of your initial recommendations, and then maybe a final triangulation of all your recommendations across different sources. Maybe at that point, you would have thought, okay, any missing information, I may need to go back and collect more information and take it through the process. I find it very useful at a team level to try to visualize the whole research process because it actually takes the methodology section that can feel a little bit onerous and breaks it down into clear sections, and it can even help you allocate work to various people in the team. The second thing that I think helps, particularly for very, very, very complex projects, is that you should try to be inspired by a sound academic paper. I remember last year I had a team that had one of those complex projects, and they actually found a paper that helped them define their methodology. And because the methodology was associated with a published peer-reviewed paper, it naturally appears rather robust, and it was well justified when applied to the client brief they were given. So consider being inspired by a sound academic paper and somehow replicating all or part of their methodology. If all else fails and you still feel inundated, beyond your faculty coach, there's a methodology institute of LSE who in the past, this is before COVID, would actually have physical drop-ins for teams or students who are having challenges with their methodological approach. feel free to rely upon them or reach out to them um, just to get some additional help and guidance. So, we've done the introduction, you've chosen your literature and completed a robust literature review. You've developed the methodology approach that will help you collect data to address the brief that is outlined. The next obvious step is the analysis. So, why is analysis important? Stop the tape, take a few seconds, reflect, and then join me on the other side. Okay, analysis or reports is the bridge between the research and the recommendations. And often, and believe it or not, I have seen quite a few projects where students neglect to showcase their analysis and put it in the appendices. I can even understand why they would do this, right? Because analysis and results is about condensing often large amounts of data into a few slides, tables, graphs, informatics, right? And one of the hardest questions you're going to be asking yourself is what goes into the appendix and what should be included in the body of the report. The litmus test I'd like to give you is that anything that's included in the appendix must not be absolutely necessary to understand the flow of the report or to generate the recommendations. If the information is absolutely necessary to understand the recommendations that are to come, then you must find a way of condensing that information and putting it into the analysis section. The second thing I want to say very importantly, because there was a challenge with this last semester also, is that the information, any analytical information you put into the appendix should be your work. There should be absolutely no plagiarism. You should not be copying and pasting methodologies from different books to try to explain your approach to the analysis. If you have used or been inspired by another paper or a chapter in a book in terms of your analytical approach, you should summarize that analytical approach and have some explanations and insights about the use of that approach. It should be 100% your work. The second challenge with analysis and results that we see coming up is the issue of coherence. Often, if you have a particularly difficult or complex methodology, because you have multiple objectives of your project, you may want to do your analysis in the same phases as your methodology. So let's say that you are looking at a problem from 2 or 3 different angles and you're using a different set of methods to analyze each objective or angle of the challenge. It may be worthwhile for you to explain the analysis associated with one, and then explain the analysis associated with the second issue, and then explain the analysis associated with the third issue, and then bring them all together at the end to explain the conclusions, as opposed to um, linking all the various analyses where it's much more difficult to understand exactly what part of the brief that you're answering with the various pieces of analysis. But that is essentially up to you. I think the most important thing is that when you are presenting your analysis, that it is coherent, that it is clear the link between the analysis and the part of the question that you're answering. And however you choose to do it is up to the team, but that clarity is required, because once that is clear, then it's easy for us to transition from the analysis to the recommendation, right? So again, analysis is the bridge between the methodology and the recommendations, right? Without the analysis, you're just describing a methodology and then you're describing a series of recommendations without us seeing the data that you are actually drawing upon to develop the recommendations. The other thing that's really important about analysis is as you present analysis, it's not just about presenting numbers, but you should be discussing the implications of the results that you found and what they mean. And you could actually link it even back to some research, or you could link it back to the client's individual situation. But it should just not be a series of this is an average of A, this is an average of B, this is what we found. It should be again linked back to the brief. I think what you're hearing from me is great presentations feel seamless. There's a common story across the whole presentation. And even in presenting the analysis, that story is still imbued or infused in the analysis so that you're understanding exactly how this analysis relates to the challenge or the brief that you've been given as students. Again, this may seem obvious to you, but I just wanted to highlight some pitfalls that we've been seeing across the years so that you would make sure that you're not that you're covering all your bases in pulling together your presentations. So here are my considerations in terms of analysis. Are your patterns identified and summarized? Are the results presented clearly and at least a few links made to existing literature, or even a few links made back to the challenge that you've been provided? And very importantly, have you answered your brief? So finally, let's move on to recommendations. And I think it's obvious the reason for recommendations. So let's just get into it. Recommendations is your ta-da moment. This section moves the report from the quasi-academic to the really practical and really discusses the nuts and bolts of your solution. Very importantly, this section must not be generic. It must be applicable to the client situation. In that way, it must be context specific. The implications for your client must also be outlined, right? Really good projects outline the implications of for your client because it shows that you have this intimate knowledge of the needs of the client and you're not just making a set of recommendations out of the context of the client's capability to implement. So often the implications for the client may be phased. Maybe there's key milestones that are required for implementation or key changes in the client's structure that might be required to implement it. Maybe key partnerships might be required. All these things move the project out of this sort of theoretical frame into a very, very practical frame. And really strong presentations show that you really understand the client and you understand how the recommendations that you're outlining will impact their business and what changes need to be made, what partnerships need to be solicited, or even that it needs to be phased. And these are just three examples. I'm sure there are other ways that you can present your recommendations to the client. But again, the important thing is this displays your intimate knowledge of the exact situation of the client. So you should consider not just the recommendations, but how the client would actually develop and roll out these recommendations. Please note that you may actually need to develop a separate presentation for the client because the client may not be as interested in the literature review or even in the methodology in depth. And because of that, they may actually prefer that you spend a much larger proportion of your time on the recommendations. And because they would like you to spend the lion's share of your time on recommendations, it may be that you'd want to develop a separate presentation for the client. But this is for you to negotiate with the client, and of course, the faculty coach will be around to help you do this. Thank you so much for listening today. So what's the way forward after today? Well, on Wednesday the 7th, which is tomorrow, we'll have our Zoom session. And there'll be a link on Moodle that you can go to click on to join the Zoom session. At that session, it will be a Q&A, and then it will be followed by a description of your projects. We have some really exciting projects. We've curated some first-class projects for you in a range of different areas, from innovation to strategy to marketing. And then I will outline the process for choosing the projects, right? Students, you will be expected to review all the proposals which will be placed on Moodle. So each project proposal will be placed on Moodle. So you can review it in further detail and then fill out a form with your top 3 choices. Freya will communicate with you to provide the links to the survey that you must fill out. And then you need to submit this to me by 9 a.m. Friday, the 9th of October. So basically, just to review this, Wednesday night we have the Zoom session. I run through a brief description of the project and the process for choosing. On Thursday, you should review all the proposals for the projects and then decide your top 3 choices and then submit to me by 9 a.m. on Friday which are your top 3 choices via a poll or survey that Freya will send out. On Monday the 12th, we see each other finally, and here I will outline the teams and we'll undertake some team initiation exercises and kind of talk about the way forward and answer any questions that you have. It is really important that everybody submits their choices by 9 a.m. on Friday because I plan to engage in reviewing that data. It takes a long while to get, because the aim is to try to get everybody in their top 3 choices and particularly top 2 choices, to be quite honest. So it takes a while to look at the spreadsheet and rework the spreadsheet to try to achieve that aim, especially since students tend to be attracted to the same projects. So it's really important that you submit your survey by 9 a.m. on Friday with your top 3 choices. Okay, so that explains Monday. We meet, we do some team stuff, and then we determine the way forward. And then by the Friday of that week, I will be assigning you all to faculty coaches. Each team will have a faculty coach that they would work with, and that would be your primary person going forward. As I said, beyond next week, I am your escalation point as opposed to your primary faculty coach. But until next week, I look forward to working with you guys. I'm excited to meet all of you, and I'm really interested in walking through and hearing any concerns that you have in our Zoom session tomorrow. I like to repeat things just in case you missed it. So the link will be placed on Moodle. And here I'm going to briefly outline the projects. I'm going to outline the process for choosing your top 3. And then we're going to have a Q&A where I will answer any questions. I really don't want any of you to be concerned or anxious about the projects. The level of support that you're getting this year is exceptional. Even the level of detail that I've gone through in explaining the various components of the project is far more detailed than I would in a previous year. But I know that it's a COVID period, and clarity and communication is so important, and opportunities to commune as together. So please do not suffer in silence. Come to the Zoom session tomorrow or come next week Monday, and I promise to provide support and listen to your questions, queries, positive comments, or any way that I can help you guys transition from me as the course leader into your faculty coach. So have a lovely afternoon, and I will see you guys tomorrow via Zoom online. Take care.